Hey, welcome back to the den, listeners and viewers. I've forsaken my usual my usual rum and sustenance or scotch for a booster juice. I figure it's time to get a little bit more healthy here. Otherwise, I'd be a lot more susceptible to the Nurgle's rot as we go through all this Glottkin business. So, with me again are my two philosophers, Vince and Keith. Please say a quick word if you would, Vince.
Absolutely. Good evening, everybody. Glad to be back with you again.
Nice seeing you guys again. It's good to be back. Talk about the Nurgle.
Absolutely. Also, what strange Canadian thing is whatever you're drinking? That is not a thing that exists in America, whatever that is.
I think that you people down there like to call it Jamba Juice.
Okay.
It's probably a similar thing.
Gotcha. All right, fair enough.
Right. It does say on this part of the label that is Canada's premium smoothies.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
So,
Everything's
there
just
it is.
a little different up there.
New sponsor for next week's episode, Booster
Right.
Juice. Their free plug.
Protect you from the Nurgle's rot with booster juice.
I want a TV ad that says that. Is the Nurgle's rot getting you down? Is the pus falling from the sky making you feel a little bit sluggish? Well, come on in and get a booster juice. You'll be right as rain again. Okay. God writes itself. Okay. So, anyway, down to business. What we covered in the first little bit of last chapter, of course, was to talk through what the brothers Glott were up to as they lumbered their way into the harbors of Marienburg and through much smashing around, spewing out of spawn and pooping out other horrible things. They also unleashed one of the jars of Nurgle that spread this contagion of a sort of a rotting vine that is spreading across, or a ground moss, I think is more of a description of it. So they've unleashed that upon the world, or upon the Empire anyway, and Marienburg has fallen, despite the Empire's great efforts, as well as some intervention from Mundvart, the resident vampire of Marienburg, and also managed to dispatch a group from Karlberg who were going to be the relief force, but ended up just being the comic relief force as they slipped around in the stones and died. So we're going to move on to focus our attention now on the next chapter, Chapter 2 this is, where one of our other trio of Nurgledom, Gutrot Spume, has landed on the north coast, to pretty much no opposition at all. But before we tell the tale of Mr. Spume, we have a little bit of a sidebar of one of our other agents of Nurgle who's deep in the underbellies of Altdorf. And Keith, maybe you could tell us about this fine gentleman.
So
Herr Doctor.
Herr Doctor is back in his cozy little underground lair in Altdorf. And he's reflecting back on how he's not had the time or the equipment or the opportunity to really work with his contagions up in the frigid north. So he's enjoying himself. He's pottering around his laboratory when a little face pops up in one of his bubbling cauldrons and reveals to him that the triplets, or the driplets, as the Nurglings call them, are on their way. They've made landfall and have taken over Marienburg. And old Maggoth Plaguefather has cooked up this little scheme, and the Nurgling reveals to Festus about that he's actually traveling, and that he should burn the Nurgling in order to create this nasty, nerdy smog across Altdorf. So it looks like Maggoth and Festus are literally cooking something up for the Altdorfers.
Yeah. At all brewing this up for the culmination of Geheimenschnatt, which is the plan of everybody to sort of converge on Altdorf at the one time. So that's where we're going to get into Mr. Spume. So this guy lands on the coast of Nordland to pretty much no opposition at all, as it turns out. And you kind of wonder why this is, but let's think about what the Empire's been through over this time. They have been assaulted at the Auric Bastion over towards the borders of Kislev. They are getting smashed from within with Sylvania, so they're drawn that way. And of course, Marienburg is the assault that's just been happening, and they're falling back into Altdorf from all directions. So it really is no surprise that the least populated province of all the empire has nothing to do to oppose this legion of chaos that's just landed upon their shores. So Gutrot Spume makes it pretty evident early that he's one of those arrogant bastard chaos lords that wants to take all the glory for himself, because everybody's trying to clamor over one another in this society to be the alpha male and the ace guy who's going to get the attention of Papa Nurgle. So he makes a decision early that he's not going to mess around. He's just going to chart the most direct line between where he's standing right now and the city of Altdorf. And that's going to take him through the Dracwold Forest. So off he goes, being toted on his war shrine through the Dracwold Forest. And he has a bit of a chance encounter with an interesting character. And Vince, maybe I'll pass it to you to tell us about this interesting character that he bumps into.
Sure. I assume you mean the Beastmen that he runs up against, yes?
I do.
Okay, very good. Yes, so I particularly like how it starts, as, yes, he's got a big bunch of Chaos Force and a bunch of heavy armored warriors and knights who start out thinking they're just like, this is no problem, we're just going to march straight through here. And then they get deep into the forest and realize, hey, this is actually pretty hard. They had to dismount, they're pulling all their war machines apart, they're, like the war shrine can barely get through. Even Gutrot's got to eventually get down off the war shrine and help push the darn thing through the woods because there's no room. And they move aside some bushes and find a big cave entrance, and what pops out but a giant toad beast thing that immediately lashes out at them with its tongue. And what I particularly like is that it immediately drives some of the Chaos Warriors insane, where they, as it starts howling, and they start killing themselves, take their axes to their own heads to stop the noise, and right there proving that this Jabberslythe was more effective than any Jabberslythe has ever been in a game of tabletop Warhammer. But that's okay.
I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yes.
We're all thinking the same thing. It's along the same lines as the common thrones that the vampires seem to employ there to great effect.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, what he runs into is a big group of beastmen, and a very sort of bespeckled Bray shaman comes out, and he runs into this is the Blackhoof tribe, I believe. If that sounds right to everybody. And he runs into them. Absolutely. And they're sort of like a Nurgle worshipping Beastmen tribe. So Gutrot gets right along with them. And the Beastman Bray Shaman says that the Crow Father had told them of his coming. And Spume is very short with him and says, either help me or let me pass. And the Beastman Bray Shaman is like, oh, well, our prophet said you were coming, and we really want to fight, so we're with you. And all of a sudden, he gains a bunch of Beastmen allies just that easily.
Do we know who the Crow Father is?
Are
we just referring to Tzeentch?
That's how I assumed it to be, that they were talking about Tzeentch being at the end of it, because Tzeentch has the ravens or whatever, right? Is the raven a crow? That's what I was thinking. But
I'm just concerned that I might have missed something in there about another Beastman shaman or lord who calls himself that.
I think it might be a reference to Nurgle. It seems kind of counterintuitive that it'd be Tzeentch, seeing as how Tzeentch and Nurgle are, mortally opposed to each other. Why would Tzeentch lead a bunch of Beastmen allies into, Spume's thing?
So do you think he just refers to Nurgle as the Crow Father, being that the Crow is perhaps deemed as a carrion bird.
Yeah, exactly. And it does mention that Nurgle has 7 favored names, whatever they might be. So maybe Plague Father, Crow Father, one of them. And also, I don't know if you know, but the old exalted hero of Zinch, he came with a little signpost, and on top of that there was a little crow as well.
Right. Okay.
All
right. Well, I kind of derailed you there, Vince. You want to
No,
carry
you're
on
fine.
with the tale of Beastmen?
Absolutely. So yes, he clearly the Beastmen Bray Shaman, they all are Nurgle people, and you're right about the Nurgle and Zinch being enemies. That's a good thing. I hadn't thought about that. That's a great point. But basically, he says, you are the tentacled one, champion of Urfather, fire told by Crowfather this last moon, and so then, and he bends the knee, and that's it. And I particularly like the line because Spume is honestly even taken aback by this. And the line that's particularly there is, behind his helm, Spume's milk-white eyes widened as 1,000 beastmen raised their blades high in salute. So he has just gained quite an army to back himself up as he continues marching on, and he's going to need it sooner than he thinks.
And oddly enough, paralleling the battlefield is probably the first time that anyone has been wide-eyedly impressed by the emergence of a Beastman army.
Yep.
Hey, if I just got a free 1,000 points of Beastmen on the table, I'd take them. Sure, absolutely.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. That would make a difference. Right. So yeah, as they march on, I just wanted to make a little sidebar and mention that back in the state of the Empire at Altdorf, Helborg is sort of being pulled at his wit's end by all the happenings going on in his poor city as it's sort of degrading upon itself. There's riots, there's food shortages, famine is going on all over the place, and the land around Altdorf is all decaying because of this touch of Nurgle that's come in. So he's having to burn piles of infected people so that their contagion doesn't spread. He's had to, as Keith said, rule with an iron fist to quell any kind of small riots that are going on or looting that goes on throughout his city. And he just hates being a diplomat. And that point of him being a diplomat comes up a little bit later in here, but I just wanted to make mention of the state of the Empire in Altdorf before we carried on with Spume's little saga. So back to you guys.
It's clear he does not have the diplomatic savvy that Karl Franz has, right? When you look back at Nagash, you watched Franz just manipulate these pieces around. I mean, not in a negative way. Just he was very good at playing politics while also being a great warrior. He's the emperor for a reason. Helborg he's a warrior. He's a soldier. This isn't the life he would want.
Yeah, right. He's the beater of the Empire, and that's sort of not his official title, but pretty much what he's all about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's pick it up again with Mr. Spume, trudging through the forest with his newfound pals, and Keith, maybe you want to resume here and tell us what he encounters.
Sure. Yeah. So with his newfound Beastmen allies, they start showing him some goat paths through the forest, and he starts making a bit of headway again, and then they happen upon a forest goblin tribe that are worshippers of the spider god. So a little bit of skirmishing is going on, and they eventually fight into a clearing where 4 Arachnarok spiders turn up and start a big old battle, as well as a bunch of savage orcs come out of nowhere and start hacking up the Chaos forces. So there's a lot of fighting going back and forth, and there's this really cool kind of magical duel going on where I think it's actually the Harbinger again. He opens his mouth and summons this giant skull in the sky that starts spitting flies at the goblins, and they're not very impressed with that. And so then there's a great goblin shaman who's sitting on the back of an Arachnarok that he takes the shafts of moonlight and turns them into a giant moon spider, and then Chaos Warriors just bursting into flame wherever this moon spider touches them. Which was kind of cool. But as the day goes, when you've got goblins fighting Chaos Warriors, they get their butt kicked, and there's this savage duel between a masked goblin war chief and Spume. And of course, Spume is kicking the crap out of this poor little gobbo. And eventually, the goblin gets unmounted and disarmed from his giant spider, and he thinks, not a problem. I'm just going to bite Spume. It turns out goblins are poisoned, which I never knew before. But unfortunately for the little goblin war chief, Spume is a little more foul than him, and he died. And that was pretty much it. Then Spume gets off his palanquin, and there's one Arachnarok who's still got a couple of legs still twitching, and he goes and he takes his great axe and smacks it into the skull of the Arachnarok. And it just so happens, very serendipitously, that the Arachnarok gives a final convulsion and shoots Spume back off his head, knocks him into the Warstrine, which then cracks open Spume's plague jar. So if you remember in Chapter 1 and the prologue, we talked about how each of the champions were given these plague jars. So Spume's plague jar gets cracked open, and this massive fluid keeps pouring out, much more than the jar could possibly contain. And these great throttle vines grow up from the ground and start bending back all of the trees of the Drakewald forest, forming these mighty tunnels. And so there's a great cry from the Chaos Warriors as the slaughter that they did that day was recognized by Nurgle, and they were blessed with this opening way, which presumably leads down to Altdorf.
Yeah. So there's a couple fun things that I think that happened in this battle that are worthy of mention, and that is that it sort of culminates with the masked chieftain, as you said in your little duel with Gutrot Spume, but it also talks a little bit earlier in the battle about how spiders are biting away at these Nurgle-infested Blight Kings that are Spume's companions. And although they're trying to poison the Blight Kings, of course, as you say, the Blight Kings themselves are kind of foul, so they're both sickening each other by biting into a Blight King. So even the little spiders that these goblins are riding around on are feeling the foul effects of it. So I thought that was kind of a cool part of the narrative. It also does a really good job of describing the frothing, ridiculous, ravaging berserkerhood of a savage orc war band, right? Like these guys get limbs chopped off, and they're still frothing away with their savage orc frenzy, and still come along for a few more strides and swing an axe once or twice more before they succumb to the fact that they've just lost 3 of their 4 limbs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead, Vince.
No, I was just gonna say, I just to come back to this one more time. I love that this. I have Tom, who some of you may know from like Warhammer Weekly. He has a whole Savage Goblin army that he built much the same way. So it's a joy to see these guys on the table, and I love that the Goblins decided that 3 Arachnarok fighters was the right number of Arachnarok fighters to bring to this, and to have their boss on a giant cave spider as well. Like this is like reading this. This is honestly really cool. Like you read this and you're like, man, I would love to play this army, to have this on the table, right? It's just a cool theme. It's a cool story, and the battle itself, they really write it well and evocatively. Of the little poison guys and the spiders jumping down from the trees and stuff. Once again, though, the true MVP of the battle, you mentioned like the white fire spider that's like going around lighting everybody up with the shaman on his back. Yeah. Do you remember who kills the shaman?
No, I forget.
From the back of this thing is on the back of an Arachnarok spider, and a Javerslythe runs up and uses his tongue to go pow, and plucks the goblin off and kills him. So not only does he kill not only does that Javerslythe kill Chaos Warriors en masse in this story, he also kills basically the enemy sort of boss caster and turns the tide of battle. MVP.
Yeah. MVP. Guaranteed. Yeah, I think it's great. The other thing I was thinking about with the Savage Orc boss is he was getting his limbs cut off and carrying on. I thought, if that Savage Orc could speak, he would sound just like the Black Knight guarding the bridge in Mount 500 Holy Grail.
What a flesh wound.
Come on back, you pansy.
We'll call it a draw.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, it unfortunately is not a draw, and off and off go Spume and his guys, unimpeded by the Drakewald as they once were. So their reward for Nurgle for that day was his jar of goo. Actually, one thing that I want to point out here about this Stranglevine that spreads out is it feeds off of all the goblins, so it kind of intertwines within the dead goblins and the spiders and drinks the juices out of them so it can continue to grow more. And that's effectively how it expands across the countryside to lead them to where they need to go. And it spreads in all directions too, so it's not just the pathway that they're taking, but the throttle vine kind of spreads in other places and makes. There's one point where they make mention a little bit later on, in case we don't touch on it, is on the roadsides of the Empire as travelers are going from village to village, if they have to stop for a night, and normally they would just pull off on the side of the road and kind of camp there, then the throttle vines would get them, and they wouldn't make it back to the road because they'd be pierced by this throttle vine and hanging 4 feet in the air with this stuff growing through them. So it's more Nurgle essence of horror and decay spreading across the countryside for you guys to think about. So there we go. Okay, so that sort of brings a close to Gutrot's chapter of chapter 2, and then we turn our attentions to chapter 3, and this is where we focus on the other third spur of the Nurgle onset. And if you remember from back in our intro, this includes the 3 Maggoth Lords, led by Orgoth's Demon Spew and his pals Morbidex Twiceborn, and the third guy, whose name just slipped me at exactly the wrong time.
Bloab Rotspawn.
Bloab Rotspawn, thank you. Bloab. So these guys, again, land off their own small ship fleet in north of the Empire, and they were kind of just sent off on their own. They didn't have a legion of an army to go along with them. But it was indicated that after the fight in the Nagash sequence on and about the Auric Bastion, that a lot of those Nurgle warriors and followers from that legion had sort of settled in at the Bloodkeep, which is not too far away from Middenheim, but up in the middle mountains that they had to scale. As it turns out, these 3 fellas from the Icehorn Peaks themselves are pretty adept at climbing mountains, so they made their way very easily through some pretty rough terrain. And there were sightings of these 3 fellas as they made their way, but no Empire citizen or militia was daring to approach them. So they would just scurry away to whatever city or town and tell of the horrors that they've seen. So unimpeded, these guys managed to meet up with the Bloodkeep, and they bolster their ranks and then carry on to head south, making a line for Talabheim. Okay, so before we get into that one, we want to maybe bring it back to another little visitation that we have on page 59 of our old pal Dr. Festus once again. And we keep coming back to this, viewers, because Festus is an entertaining gent, quite honestly. he's one of the he's a little bit of comic relief, and he has some good exchanges in here, and he does have a part to play in this whole thing that's going to come together in the culmination later on. But Keith, you wanna tell us about this little sidebar?
Yeah, so this is a quick little one where Festus, again, he's pottering around his lab, he's cooking up with some corpses and adding hands to his brews and things like that. And a face pops out of his cauldron again, and it's old Kugas Father. And basically, he's just asking him, how's the stuff going? Have you gotten the 7 ingredients for the spell ready yet? And, Festus is like, I'm working on it, don't worry about it, it'll happen. Kugas is bringing good news. He's saying, the Glottkin, they're on their way, and just had word from Spume, so he's going to make his way. Giving him updates saying everyone's going to get there get him this nap and keep up the good work.
Yeah, your German is very polished, Keith. You nailed that.
Oh, thank you.
Speaking of Germans, or guys that I imagine speak in a Germanic accent, we have a little bit of a sidebar here where we bring back into play, for the first time since the Auric Bastion battles, Vlad von Carstein. And Vince, I know that this guy is one of your favorite dudes. So do you recall this little episode with Vlad?
Yeah, absolutely. So Vlad continues to be the only person in the Empire who actually grasps the severity of the situation and knows what's going on. And he comes upon the sort of decomposing bodies dangling in the throttle vine, right? And he, sort of tries to investigate, and they kind of snap at him, so he goes incorporeal, he goes all gaseous form like vampires can do. And he goes out there and he checks it out, hacks one off with his sword, and it's all full of like gross, disgusting blood sap poison. And that's when he sort of realizes, hey, the Auric Bastion was just a decoy. Like, that whole thing that we thought was such a major fight, that was nothing. The real way the Empire is going to fall is from within, and I got to get some people on this fast, because we've got hell coming down on us, and nobody even knows yet, basically. And they even make a special point a little earlier of calling out how all of the scouts that had taken witness of Spume's advance had been caught and killed, exempting one, a huntsmaster who went to also warn the Reichsmarschall. And so very little word is getting around the Empire right now of just how serious their situation is, and that prompts Vlad to pen a little note to the Reichsmarschall to once again try to prompt him to find his sanity and form an alliance.
Right, and Vlad had made this pitch in the past directly to Karl Franz, of course, or through the agents of Karl Franz when they were up in the north fighting against chaos, and said, you know what, we need to unite for a common cause. We both want to see the Empire withhold this fight against chaos. So as Helborg, so we're going to switch gears back to Altdorf just for a moment. So Helborg is mucking about there. Well, I shouldn't say mucking about, but he's quelling another riot. And as he's wiping his own sword free of the blood from some usurpers, he gets a desperate young messenger show up in his stateroom, and he presents him with a notice that appears to have the seal of the von Carstein family. So immediately the Reichsmarschall screws up his face, and he's like, oh, this cannot be anything good. But yet, he asks the guy he entertains him for a moment. He says, well, we'll read this message. And effectively, to paraphrase this really quickly, and what's cool about this story is the messenger begins in a quavering voice, and he's afraid and he's terrified because the Reichsmarschall looks like he's about to slice his own head off. So he just gingerly kind of introduces the idea and cautiously, and needs to be encouraged to spit out the words of this message. But as he carries on reading and describing what Vlad is proposing as an ultimate alliance, he begins to become taken over by Vlad's own persona. And so he builds in strength and power, he builds in tone, he actually changes his accent to that Sylvanian accent and sounds by the end of it in the very commanding voice of a man of Vlad's stature and nobility and age and wisdom. So by the end of the time that he's done reading this message, it is with full conviction that this seems like the only thing that that the Reichsmarschall can do is accept it. But Helborg, being a stubborn bastard as he is, grabs the note, crumples it up, curses the name of the von Carstein, sends this poor wretch away, who is now, once he's finished reading his message, collapses in a heap, shivering and bleeding from the face and the nose, sends him off to the temples of Shalia, and told to the girls of Shalia that this guy's top priority and you need to cleanse this guy. Because, of course, the worry is that he is possessed by Vlad and he will just turn into Vlad. But for the moment, Helborg is unswayed for the moment, despite Vlad's, once again, very logical and positive message to the Empire. So we leave it there. We move away again from Altdorf. And we get a little bit of a segue over to Gregor Martak. Remember, this is the guy that replaced Balthasar Gelt as the Supreme Patriarch of the College of Wizards. Okay. Takes away, gents. Gregor Martak. What do you remember about this, gent?
Yeah, so he's the new, as you said, Supreme Patriarch, and he's a beast wizard taking over. And so what's of course relevant about that to our story, besides the fact that he sleeps in stables and feels more comfortable amongst dung than in like a stately office, is that he has a special connection with Tal, the Beast Lord god. And of course we remember from the last from 2 chapters back, that Tal had a visit from old grandfather, and had gotten himself deeply infected by Nurgle's touch. And Martak has been sleeping fitfully of late, if at all, and he keeps having dreams of his god lying on the floor of a forest, covered completely in this black moss, sort of the same moss that is and sickness that is overtaking the Empire. And next to him is this beautiful maiden god saying that there's nothing she can do for him. She cannot, or goddess, I should say, whatever. And there's nothing she can do for him. She's basically saying that, you know, there's that the land is poisoned, and so you are poisoned. It's just it is what it is. And she's very sad at this, and he is telling her to be strong and comforting her as basically death comes for him. And what this short little scene shows us, this little aside, is that there's much more on the line here than just the people and lands of the Empire. The gods of the Empire are suffering in turn, and will fade away and be swept up in the same chaos and destruction as their people if these plans are all carried to fruition.
Yeah, so again, we kind of part of what I like about this story, because a lot of it is just horror and blight and warring and hacking and slashing and pus squirting out of things. It is kind of refreshing to have this divine perspective that they throw into the storyline to make you think that it's greater than just man versus beast throughout most of it. So I kind of like these little segues into the divine, so to speak.
It also sets up, and the female goddess is supposed to be Shaila. I don't know how you say it. Shalia. There you go. Yes, the goddess or god of healers, right? And obviously, and we know that she's going to play a big part as this story goes on. So we're kind of sort of subtly introducing her here, and she's going to be a big sort of figure as the story progresses.
Now, before we return our story to the three big heavies that are coming down out of the middle of mountains from Bloodkeep, there's a couple of quick segues that go on here, and they involve the Bretonnians and the Beastmen. Keith, which of those do you want to speak to?
I'll take the Beastmen, mainly because I don't want to pronounce the Bretonnian king's name.
Okay, go to it.
So the Harbinger is very unique amongst Beastmen in that he's able to summon demons. So on a night where Morsleab is bright in the sky, he enacts this great ritual to bring forth and summon just a host of demons. So he's standing on this giant mound of corpses, screaming to the skies, and then all the herdstones in the Drakewald and around the Empire just explode and rent open portals to the realm of chaos. And from that spew forth plague bearers and Epidemius himself. That'll play a big part in we'll get to in just a moment.
I think that is awesome, actually. That's the biggest deal that the Beastmen have had effects on this end time story. And they don't even spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's a big deal.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that makes me just a little bit sad about the book, because there's a lot of subtext and a lot of really subtle hints that go on for certain characters. Like, it's constantly saying how Gutrot Spume is putting himself up as the actual chosen of Nurgle, and he kind of resents the Glottkin, and that's why he wants to get to Altdorf before them. That's why he cuts straight through the drop wall, and then it never comes up again. And same with the Harbinger. He's a super cool character. He does this one awesome thing, but it's kind of summarized in a couple paragraphs and then just left alone. Mm-hmm. You know, and then there's a couple, again, there's a bunch of characters here that get names, like that Berserker Savage Orc. He's named, but, you know, he dies a page after he gets introduced. So I feel like it's a lot in the writing, something I'm not a massive fan of, and they can't just say the Savage Orc War Boss, he has to have a name. And I would have liked to see a little more character development for things like the Harbinger, or maybe Spume trying to betray the Glottkin or something like that, you know?
Yeah, sure. Right. Well, our other little segue here I just want to introduce really quickly, and that is that Bretonnian, who took the brunt of a whole lot of punishment in the Nagash, have once Gilles Le Breton revealed himself as the Green Knight and took over leadership of the Bretonnians again. We also kind of left the old king of Bretonnia, Leoncoeur, who was cut down by his own son, Turncoat, who was turned into a vampire. And we all thought that Leoncoeur was dead. I mean, did any of you, when you were reading that for the first time, think anything else could be possible?
Oh, I remember reading right away when people were talking about spoilers out of the story. Even before I looked at the book, everyone's like, oh, King's dead, you know? And this is like the first time we get introduced to the most important rule of the end times. That just like a comic book villain, if you do not have a drawn and quartered body in front of you, assume they are not dead. Like, anybody who dies even slightly off camera, they're still alive.
Yeah, that is what we've learned. So unless the head is rolling across the battlefield at your feet, yeah, yes, there's still a chance. So after that, obviously we revealed Leoncoeur is back, baby. He is now named as the High Paladin of the Lady. That's his new title instead of King of Bretonnia. So he's taken a demotion, he's taken the job on, and he's going to give it his best. So what he does is he rallies what able knights there still are after the disaster at La Maison Tal and various other infightings and civil wars and troubles in Bretonnia, and marches them out towards Altdorf, because they can tell from all the signs that that's where shit's going to go down. So there's another character of importance in here that is known as Jared. So those two guys sort of lead the phalanxes of knights and ride as hard as they've ever ridden before, relentlessly towards Altdorf, with hopes of helping out before Altdorf gets overrun by Nurgle. So let's hope they get there, kids, because the Bretonnians need some action. They need some good news.
Absolutely.
Okay.
There we go.
So,
riding along.
Yeah, Vince is trying to help out the cause as well and keep the population up. Good man. So maybe Vince, we'll turn it to you to as we turn our scenes back to the trio of Gorgoth's Demon Spew and his crowd as they make their way south.
Yeah. So the Maggoth Lords have picked up some forces. Not a lot, though, honestly. Their force is still pretty small, and but they're making their way up through these big mountains, and which is where they're adept. They're from the Icehorn Peaks or whatever the name of it is originally. These are mountain men, as it were, and longtime worshippers of Nurgle. They know well. They are as hardy gets. And they've got a nice light force on their hands, and they make their way quickly through the mountains. And 2 times or whatever, they're spotted a little, but they don't really face any major resistance, because how could they? Their force is small, they're quick, and they're traveling over terrain that you can't really bring an army up against them. And they eventually come up against Talabheim, I guess is the name of it, right? That's the name of the city? How you say it?
That's Talabheim, yes.
Talabheim, yeah. These names are, I apologize, names, I am not as good with it as you. I have not studied my German. So, yes, they show up, and the thing about Talabheim that's notable is it's this Talabheim crater. So it's kind of in this very sort of defensible crater, right? And so 2 things come about here. First, they kind of jump in, and they start the battle. They just, some of their forces just run right in and charge out. And at first, they have a lot of big victory. They're sort of killing their way through the streets, doing a great job. But the problem is that Talabheim is one of the biggest cities in the Empire, and is actually still very well defended. And they kind of get ahead of themselves and charge in, not necessarily the 3 Maggoth Lords, but a lot of their forces. And they find the tip of their spear, as it were, blunted against the Empire's forces. As, this Empire isn't a pushover. These aren't Marienburgers. These people up here in Talabheim, they're experienced soldiers, and, they have a lot of power at their command. They have artillery. They even have a steam tank up here. And the Maggoth Lord's forces sort of clearly find themselves sort of outmatched and have to retreat. And only about half of the invading force of the Maggoth Lords actually make it back out of the city and back to the safety of the tree line on the other side of the walls. So their initial assault is really an utter failure. Yes, they killed some of the guards on the wall and probably, killed some citizens, but the Empire more or less repulses them pretty handily. Unfortunately, we then have a new combatant enter the fray as the Maggoth Lords get some unexpected help in the form of a man with a stick. If somebody wants to pick it up from there.
Yeah, Keith. Well, you touched on this a moment ago, because we're going to give the hockey assist for this battle to the Beastmen, who made it available for the demons to rip forth into out of the Dracwold forest. So they get the hockey assist, but the most direct assist goes to this man that you're going to talk about.
Good old Epidemius the Tallyman. So Epidemius turns up. He's got a big old host of plague bearers and rot flies and whatnot. And so after their defeat, the Maggoth Lords are very happy to see these reinforcements. And there's this really nice little description of what happens next. So Orgoth is kind of explained to Epidemius, they're just too good, they're too well defended. I don't even know that with all these reinforcements we can do it. And Epidemius kind of in a really kind of frustrated and just annoyed schoolmaster type way, he gets down off his palanquin, saunters over to Orgoth's Maggoth, and then just delicately taps on the plague jar as if the answer's right here in front of you, idiot. All you got to do is use what Nurgle gave you. So they build this massive pyre. And Orgoth dumps the contents of the jar on top of it, and this great storm starts building over Talabheim, and starts raining down this milky white, gooey fluid, all pussy and nice, and starts infecting the Talabheim, the guard. And so Epidemius is kind of well, if we can't get to them, we'll get them to come to us. So he starts this massive infection across Talabheim, mass hysteria starts breaking out, and they really force the issue and start the attack. So the demon forces, along with the Maggoth Lords, they're assaulting the walls again. There's this group called the Brass Balls or the Brazen Balls.
It was the Brass Balls, yeah.
Well, yeah. This is my favorite name of all of the units in all these descriptions.
Yeah.
They are the.
Oh, I was going to call this one out too. Yeah, this was on my list.
They are the Talabheim Bronze Balls.
Oh, bronze. Sorry.
Bronze Balls.
The Bronze Balls.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to explain what they did, Kieran?
Well, first I want to quickly say about this whole posse reign thing, because this was the moment I was reading this point in the text, and there was a couple times where I thought to myself, oh, that's gross, but I kept reading, right? Like there's a bunch of times earlier I thought, oh, that's gross, and I just kept going. I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird and horrible. But this description here was a time that I actually walked away from the book for a while. So to build upon what Keith said, is they brewed this thing, and it was a concentrated cloud that just built up around the city of Talabheim and funneled all of its rain, and the rain is of pus and blood and contagion and goo, and they describe it dripping down faces and people trying to take shelter in their house, but it's rotting away at the very shelter that they're in. And it rains so concentrated that it actually builds up beyond an ankle-deep, like effectively just flood of pus that goes throughout the city. And that is what forces the people of Talabheim to step outside the crater, because the crater is what's keeping that flood inside and that pool inside that they got to slosh around in. So that's actually what brings them outside of the crater. And as I said, I had to take time out from that and regroup, and then come back into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
I was going to say, on the topic of kind of gross images, one of my favorite ones is when the rot flies are coming along the brass ballers, and it specifically describes them of just like rubbing their forearms together in anticipation of the feast to come or something. And just that image is, I don't know if you've ever seen a fly up really close when it's rubbing its legs together and then touching the food that it's landed on and stuff like that. It's a little bit icky.
Well, so then the siege itself ensues, right? And we have a couple of important leaders here: the commander von Stryhoff, and there's also a wizard, a beast wizard there called Adric Greenwood. It sounds like a D&D name, like straight out of some old Ed Greenwood book. Maybe that's why I think of Ed Greenwood right away, because of that name, Adric Greenwood. Was there such a guy in the D&D history, Vince?
Not that I know of, but I mean, you never know with Ed. I mean, he's one of your people, so he's closer to the earth. All of you up there in Canada, the wild lands of the north.
Yeah, sure. So the siege ensues, and the bronze balls. I don't know. There probably were other people in Talabheim that did a great job here, but I just keep thinking about the bronze balls and how fantastic they were. But they stood their ground, and they blasted away at demons, and they blasted away at rot flies, and they loaded their rifles up again and again and again, and just blasted holes in all the demons to make them sort of disappear into the rift. So it was really looking good still for the Talabheim defenders early, even though they're sickly and noxious. But at range, as we know, with a lot of gunpowder and cannon shot, things look pretty good. In fact, one of the Maggoth Lords, his Maggoth takes a ripping cannonball that just tears a gigantic chunk out of him, but still manages to live through it. I think it was Morbidex, wasn't it?
Yeah, Morbidex's Maggoth. It blows like the left side of the thing's body off. But as a testament to how tough they are, it talks about how in between a cannonball hitting him and him like basically getting to the lines to fight, such was the power of his regeneration that he already has like a new tiny spindly skeletal arm there that's popped out and is just like starting to stitch flesh and tendon back together.
Yeah. So Epidemius is leading from the back, and he's making sure that he counts all the contagions along the way, and gets his legion after legion of rotting plague bearers to climb their way into there. goes through descriptions, of course, as you'd expect out of plague bearers, that they just kind of rush in with impunity, and although that they're burying themselves on spearheads and halberd heads, they just kind of reach out and lay their pussy flies into you and try to stab away with their rusty blades. But they take a great toll, as you expect, though. In the end of it all, the Empire soldiers can only hold out for so long, and they eventually do get overrun by the combined force of the plague bearers and another great regiment name. I'm going to give it up to the Chaos side because they have a really great regiment name too, and that's the Repugnauts of the Brass Keep.
That's pretty good. Yeah, there's two moments in the battle that I think are worth calling out that I really like. One, the Beast Wizard, the Amber Wizard, or whatever he is, who's here, uses the transformation of Kadan, and much like Once Bitten, clearly bought the Storm of Magic book because he figured out that mountain chimeras or whatever are like really a bonzer thing to turn into, and he starts going crazy on everybody, and it talks like he almost takes out one of the Maggoth Lords, and it takes like a combination of the Maggoth Lords and the regular troops and everything to finally bring this guy down after he just rends destruction amongst their forces. So I thought that was really neat to see that spell, because I don't know that I've ever read a description of a wizard in the world using the transformation of Kadan, and it seems like it'd be a really cool, imposing thing, and it was pretty awesome. And the other thing that I like is how they finally bring down the steam tank. Is called the Mirage Liano, and it's kind of getting a little weathered, but it's holding up. I mean, it's a steam tank. They're not easy to bring down. And does anyone remember how the steam tank accidentally fells itself?
I do.
Well, okay. Yes, your boy Epidemius has a little part to play in that, doesn't he?
Yeah, so if somebody else wants to take this, because it makes me laugh to no end what they end up doing with it.
Go, Keith.
So, yeah, again, Epidemius, he's, pretty concentrated on keeping his tally and stuff like that, and this steam tank's, he's got no love for it, so he just kind of waves off a couple of Nurglings, and one cheeky little guy decides that he just shoves his butt into the cannon, and then the steam tank just explodes. Bursts the steam, there's shrapnel everywhere. There's one Nurgle, or one little cheeky Nurgling just having a great time, blowing up stacks.
Yeah, cheeky indeed.
Yes, I can just see that fat little guy climbing in there and just being like, hee.
Just wiggling his way in.
Yeah, it's great.
All right. As a little side note here, I think it's we're talking about transformation of Kadan, and I'm going to step aside out of the Glottkin book just for a moment. Keith and I played a game a couple of weeks ago where he had a skink priest that he turned into a mountain chimera. And I tried my darndest to dispel it, and he killed Valten with Gal Miraz in his hands.
Not even a problem.
Nice. Yeah.
Do you remember the only reason he was able to kill Valten, Kieran?
Because he had 12 attacks.
No, it's because Valten tripped in the woods. No, he tripped in the woods and he took a twig to the eye, and that's why Valten died.
Yeah, that was the extra wound that finished him off, or got him softened up enough so that this big chimera could kill him. Yeah, it was a fun moment. It was a good Warhammer moment.
That was good.
Yeah. So anyway, back into the book. Let's go. So I guess as we've kind of alluded to, poor Talabheim could only hold out for so long, and they were thrashed by the combined might of Chaos Warriors, Maggoth Lords, and Epidemius' host of demons. So that kind of brings us near to the close of the chapter, but there's a few kind of little wrap-up points I think that we might want to touch on. And there's a couple things to say as we're sort of coming together here, and that is that we span our view back towards Middenheim and down the River Reich for a second, and this moss that was unleashed upon Middenheim is spreading down the riverside all the way to Altdorf, and that's the line of march that are taken by our friends the Glottkin as they make their way. And of course, they ravage a few towns along the way. They stomp on Karlburg itself, that is now depleted of any of its garrison, and they sort of keep their host up as they make their way forward. Back into the Dracwald Forest, Spume, of course, is making his way south in the most direct route that he can, and is closing in. And what else do we have in here besides that you guys can recall that closes out?
You get a nice little mention of Karl Franz, who's basically walking back to Altdorf. I mean, more or less, he's like on foot. Deathclaw is too wounded to fly or fight, and I don't even know if they actually say it's Karl Franz, but I mean it's clearly him. I don't know how many wounded people with that kind of determination or have wounded griffins with them.
All right, yeah. So that's an easy giveaway.
Yeah.
It's kind of wonder how he goes unnoticed all that time, wandering with a griffin at his side.
A giant.
I mean, I get
of a griffin.
I get that the Empire's a little less populated at this time, but honestly, people, you'd think you'd figure that one out.
Yes, I like how it even says his priceless rune sword bound out of sight. I'm not sure that's enough. You're still Karl Franz.
I don't know.
You're on the money.
Yeah.
Like, that's his picture. Not everybody knows what he looks like. He's not a secret guy.
Yeah. We have a little bit of a segue over to look at. We got an image of Mr. Archaon sitting astride his steed, sort of just nothing more than just a little paragraph to remind you that he is still the mastermind behind all of this chaos stuff. Just to remind you that he's involved before we move on with the rest of it as well. And you get a little bit of a look in on Papa Nurgle as well, and Kugarth one more time, just to remind you that he's there and he's involved. And what else do we get here? Because they kind of try to wrap up a whole bunch of things in a couple of pages.
There's an image of Shalea and Ulrich. They're looking on at Tal as he writhes in fever and sickness. And then the very last image is Helborg. He runs up to the highest point in the castle with a flaming brand and lights a torch, which is kind of the signal that he's decided to make his pact with Vlad.
Yep.
Yes, that's right. It actually closes out by saying that he is admitting to making the deadliest compromise that he is presented with. So things are desperate, of course, as we can all kind of put this and piece it together. So then, I think, gents, we're going to leave it there for the moment, and that brings us to the wrap-up of chapters 2 and 3, with one more chapter to go in the Glottkin book. So we'll say farewell for the moment to our viewers, and please tune in again for another installment of The End Times.